This week, we mark 20 years after the horrific attacks of September 11th on our nation. This as we've watched the botched evacuation of Afghanistan unfold, and we ask, where is the war on terror headed? Welcome back to the Foreign Desk Podcast. I'm Lisa Daftari. I'd like to welcome to the show today's guest, former FBI agent Bobby Chacon, who has worked extensively on counterterror investigations, including extensive assignments in Iraq, and since retiring in 2014, Agent Chacon has worked as technical advisor and writer on Criminal Minds, and has since worked on series from HBO Max and ABC. He also has a new podcast out, After the Fall, the FBI's investigation into 9/11. A very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much for having me, Lisa.
Of course. I've been wanting to have you on my show for a very long time. Obviously, we've crossed paths at Fox and at CNN, and you're absolutely one of the foremost experts in domestic counterterrorism. I know you've also been abroad, so you understand the Middle East and North African landscape when it comes to terrorism. But let's start with this week's 20th anniversary. I think any American who's old enough to remember the attacks of September 11th, particularly those who were in New York City or the DC area, always have a story of where they were that morning, what they were doing when they got the news. And you have an especially interesting story to tell.
Yes. Well, I mean, yeah, it was... it was a terrible day for all of us, in the country. As a native New Yorker who grew up basically with a father who was a detective sergeant in the NYPD, and later my brother became an NYPD detective, and I went into the FBI, first going to law school. But growing up in New York and just being a New Yorker, and that day, I think, while it affected the whole country, affected us, on a different level. And I was assigned to the FBI office in New York City on 9/11. I had been there about 14 years already as an agent. And my position was, I was the leader of the FBI dive team. It was the only dive team in the FBI. So we traveled all over the country, really all over the world, providing services for anyone who needed it. In August of 2001, I flew out to Michigan to help the Michigan State Police with a case, and they requested our assistance to recover a gun in Lake Michigan. So we, as we normally did, I would fly in advance. I'd come back to New York. I'd get the gear ready and the team ready, and then we would go out for the job on the morning of December 11th, 2001. Me and half the team were on an early flight out of Newark Airport to Chicago, and then on up to Traverse City, Michigan. So we went to, the rest of the team was going to follow us later in the afternoon. And so me and three other armed FBI agents who were on my team boarded our flight in Newark, United 91. It was Newark to Chicago. And as we all know, as most of us know, United 93 was Newark to San Francisco. So it was the same plane. It was a 757. However, we were only going half the country, across half the country. They were going all the way to the West Coast. They were one ahead of us in the flight path because when you're going to Chicago and San Francisco, it's the same flight path halfway across the country. And so we probably boarded in the adjacent gate, probably 30, 40, 50 feet from the terrorists and all the poor innocent souls who perished that day on United 93. And so as we taxied and took off, they took off a bit ahead of us, I believe. And as we taxied and took off out of Newark, we took off to the north. And as a New Yorker, I always gazed out my window, and I was lucky enough to be on the east side of the aircraft that day, and I was looking out at Lower Manhattan. And as we all know, it was a very beautiful, clear day in New York that day. And I was looking at the towers because they were iconic and they stick out, and they're a symbol of New York. And I grew up looking at them. I grew up watching them be built. And as I'm watching the towers, I see something impact the North Tower. I see debris. I see smoke. I see a flash and kind of like glitter falling. Did not actually know it was a plane impacting the tower, but I knew it was something from outside. And, previously we had planes, like small planes, run into the Empire State Building back in the 50s or 60s, and you hear those stories. And so the only thing that could be up that high would be an aircraft. And I turned around and I looked at one of my colleagues who was also an armed FBI agent sitting about 3 rows behind me, and he was looking out too. And I kind of, in my seat, turned around, and we both just shrugged our shoulders like, what was that? We said to each other. And we didn't know at the time. And you know, our plane continues to climb and bank west. And it wasn't shortly thereafter that the co-pilot came in to the cabin and walked down the aisle. Now, I should preface this by saying that when we travel armed, when we check in, the airline makes out a slip of paper that notifies the captain and the whole flight crew that they have armed passengers on board, who they are and where they're sitting. And then when we pre-board, often we would meet the captain and the co-pilot, so we have a face-to-face. They know what we look like, and the flight crew does the same. So all the flight attendants know who we are, what we look like. And so the co-pilot came back and she kind of signaled for the four of us to meet her in the back galley, which we did. And the whole back of the aircraft was empty. And if you remember, the 9/11 hijackers picked a Tuesday because it was the least traveled day. They did their homework. It was the least traveled day. So they knew those planes would have very few passengers on each one of them. And that's just statistically there to determine. And so in the back of our aircraft, there was basically nobody sitting. I remember one person maybe in the last 10 rows, only one person, looked like it was a student on a laptop working. So we get into the back alley and the co-pilot tells us, look, the World Trade Center has been hit by aircraft. We have many other aircrafts. I think she said like 24 hijacked, or at least not responding to radio traffic from air traffic control. She says, I think we just have a massive hijacking going on. And so remember, this is very early in the situation. So there's a lot of not misinformation, but there's a lot of misinformation that's kind of going back and forth, and rumors and things. And so, you know, we have to figure out what we do. So I took myself and two of my agents, my team members, and I went into the cockpit to talk to the captain. And I positioned two of them outside the cockpit door, and I left the fourth person way in the back behind everybody else. And the captain was at that time trying to raise United 93, because I think that air traffic control, because they were having trouble raising 93 at that point, I believe that their transponder had already been turned off. So I think that because we were supposed to be the closest one to that plane, the captain was tasked with point to point trying to raise them on the radio, and was not having any success. And so I was talking to the co-pilot, and I kind of asked what was going on, and she described to me that their sister flight, 93, who was, by the way, they were in that morning in the United Pilots Lounge at Newark Airport talking to those pilots, going over the weather reports and the winds and what they're, because they were going to fly almost the same flight path, at least halfway across the country. And so they were, they were going over their flight plans and the weather and things like that. And so the co-pilot said, well, they're not responding to the radio, and they've shut their transponder off. And I asked her, because the pilot is now engaged in trying to raise them, and I asked her, why would they shut their transponder off? And I think the pilot must have been listening to one ear to our conversation, and he kind of turned and kind of barked a little bit, but I understood. He says they wouldn't, they wouldn't. He meant they wouldn't turn their transponder off. So I looked at the co-pilot, not wanting to bother the pilot, and I said, what does that mean? You just told me the transponder's off, and he's telling me that they wouldn't turn the transponders off. And she said at that point, I could tell that she was getting a little emotional, and her eyes were welling up, and she says, well, we think that means they're not in control of that aircraft. Wow. And, from the 70s, in the 80s, when we had those political hijackings and they wanted to be taken to Angola, they wanted to be taken to Cuba, the pilot's standing order was take them wherever they want to go. Listen to the hijackers, do what they say, get on the ground, get the aircraft and the passengers safe, and we'll start negotiating whatever we need to negotiate for your release. So it was always, you stay in control of the aircraft. Mm-hmm. You get where they want you to go. Don't fight it. Just take them where they want to go. Get that aircraft on the ground and keep everybody safe. And so that was the standing order. So the pilots would never give up control of their aircraft willingly. And so I think she was basically acknowledging to me that her coworkers were probably incapacitated to some extent, and I don't know if she thought likely dead, but which was the case. But I think there was a realization that there was some violent takeover of that aircraft on her part. And so I just said, well, you keep us safe out here, we'll keep you safe back there. And so I left the cockpit and I gathered my guys again. I told them what the plan was going to be. And so there was actually, I believe there was a seat or two left in first class that I then put our guys in. I sat in my, I took an available aisle seat behind me. Oh, sorry. I took an available aisle seat behind me, and we continued the rest of the flight. So we were originally en route to Chicago. We were never going to make Chicago because the Sears Tower is now a possible target. And so they diverted us, and they said, we're not going to let you near Chicago. So we ultimately landed in Detroit. And by the time we got down, we were one of the last planes, I think, to land, because the Detroit airport was packed. I'd never seen an airport where you had planes parked so close to other planes outside of gates on the side runways and things like that. And we didn't have a gate to go to. And so the pilot said, look, we're going to pull in, we're going to have a stairs, you're going to get down, and you're going to wait for your luggage under the plane. It was very unusual, because we're all standing around on a tarmac, basically, which is, very prohibited. And so, we did that. We waited for our luggage. And then I'm on the phone trying to get our Detroit FBI office for some assistance, because, you got 4 New Yorkers, we got to get back to New York, and luckily, Attorney General Ashcroft was scheduled to be in Detroit that morning, I believe. And so his advance team, the FBI provides the protective detail for the Attorney General. And so they had his advance team of 8 FBI agents on the security, had 2 15-passenger vans, and they only needed 1 to get back to Washington because they had to drive as well. And so, I coordinated with our Detroit office, and they got us that second 15-passenger van, and we got in it, and we drove because there were no rental cars available. Right. And the four of us then drove the rest of the day and evening back to New York, back to Newark Airport to get our FBI cars that were parked in long-term parking. And then we dropped that van off, and we went into Manhattan. And I got there sometime, I believe it was dark and it was night, and I don't know if it was 10 o'clock, midnight, 2 a.m. I don't know, but I remember I got into Manhattan, into our 26th Street garage command post, and then they sent me down to Ground Zero. I got to Ground Zero. I remember seeing the lights and the smoke, and it was just, that was it. I saw it, and I was standing there in shock. On the drive back from Detroit to New York, we were talking occasionally. There was a lot of silence, but we were discussing how many of our coworkers we thought might be dead, and how many people in general might be dead. And I think of the 4 of us, I think the lowest estimate was probably 15 or 20,000 people, because we knew how many people worked in those buildings, how many people just transit through the PATH station, which is underneath the World Trade Center. Right. How many tens of thousands of people just transit through or in that mall below when those buildings collapsed. And so, I had heard on the plane, people started using the plane phones that the buildings collapsed. And I attributed that to non-New Yorkers not knowing really what they're talking about and believing the rumors, because I kind of laughed a little bit inside myself, because as a New Yorker, those buildings, they couldn't collapse. They're not going to come down. And it wasn't until we were walking through this very chaotic terminal, and I looked over and we all stopped for a minute, and there was a big screen TV in a bar, and it was showing the collapsing towers, that I actually stood in shock and could not believe what I was seeing, watching those towers go. And then at that point, that's when you realize, my brother's an NYPD cop working in Manhattan. We have friends that the FBI office was only 4 blocks from the towers. And I knew most of my coworkers would be running down there at the initial attack, and just wondering how many, as those towers are collapsing, we're just thinking how many people we know are dying right at that moment. I lived in Hoboken, New Jersey at the time, which is just across the river with a beautiful view of Manhattan. And Hoboken is a feeder community. Everybody in Hoboken almost works in Manhattan. They take the PATH train. It's 1 stop to the World Trade Center. And I had 6 people in my building. I lived in a 5-story apartment building, and 6 people in my building died that day, and 200 people in our town. And we were only a 1 square mile town. Yeah. And we lost the most people of any town outside of New York State. And so, when we got back to Ground Zero, we just started working, and I was assigned for a week at Ground Zero, a week up at the morgue, and a week out at the landfill. And I just did that rotation after that.
I've had complete goosebumps the entire time you've been speaking. I also lived in northern New Jersey at the time, so I know that everybody knew at least somebody, if not somebody's, who passed, and it was just a horrific time. And for you to have that experience first on the plane, to say, what if? I know you had such a compelling social media post on Instagram and other platforms talking about going to sleep wondering what if, we, the armed FBI officers, would have been on one of those planes. When you got to ground zero and you stood there, I actually had the opportunity to go on October 11th, the 1 month afterwards, and it was as if it just happened. I mean, there were piles of rubble, and it smelled like burnt rubber and metals, and I can't imagine what it was like the night of. Can you paint that picture for us? I'm sure it's something that doesn't get erased from your memory.
Yeah, it was different because being a New Yorker and working downtown, it's a very there's certain energy. There's an energy in Manhattan that people will talk of, and it's true and it's palpable. And so when you're working down there, even at night, you're out there, and even though it's kind of a business district, there's still a certain energy. And there was a different energy when I arrived at Ground Zero on the night of 9/11. They had the big lights partially set up already. It looked like almost like a Hollywood movie set, when you have those huge lights hanging from cranes and things, and they were just setting those things up. And there's still a rescue going on at that point, so you hear people yelling and shouting, and you hear people going quiet, and for days that went on. I remember working on the pile in one of those very long lines where you're handing buckets hand to hand, moving debris. Because they couldn't move the heavy equipment in yet because they thought people must still be alive. And every once in a while, they would shout to everybody to be quiet, stop talking, because one of the dogs heard something, or one of the devices that they were using to feed snake down through the rubble to listen for people, they might have picked up something. So the word would go out, everybody kind of quiet. It would happen every couple of minutes or so. And so in the beginning, when I got there, it was dark, but it had this artificial light illuminating it, which is kind of surreal, right? It's not the natural light. And so you have this unnatural light, and you have this very unnatural odor, as you describe it well. And then you just have this energy that's kind of death. It's kind of,
it was eerie. Yeah.
It's a very eerie thing. It wasn't the normal energy that you feed off of in Manhattan, the lively energy.
Right. Yeah, the way I described it was you could hear a pin drop in Lower Manhattan, which is unheard of even on Christmas Day.
Yeah. Yes, very much so.
What was your exact role in not just that day and the months that followed, but in the last, until you retired? Was this something that you worked on? Was it something that you continued your investigations on?
Well, in my role, because I was head of the dive team, so the dive team obviously suspended all operations temporarily, and so we filled in wherever we could. And so I would spend, for a couple of months, I would spend, like I said, a week at each of the locations. We had 3 locations basically in Manhattan. You had physical locations, so you had the morgue, you had Ground Zero, and then you had the Fresh Kills landfill, which is where all the debris from Ground Zero was being loaded onto barges and floated across, and it was being sifted through there. All of those fell under the purview of the evidence response program, or the evidence response team, which is the Bureau's, for lack of a better term, CSI people. But for us, it's called ERT. And our ERT program was in charge of the physical sites of the morgue. Jerry Cacuzo, a friend of mine, was at the morgue. Richard Marks was a terrific agent that ran the Staten Island landfill, the Fresh Kills operation. And then we had a number of people running the Ground Zero operation. So the dive team was part of ERT. We were overseen by the FBI laboratory division that housed and funded and trained the ERT program, and we were part of ERT. And so as a dive team member, I was kind of integrated with ERT, and I would circulate through those areas. I would occasionally go up to 26th Street Garage because my squad was the special operations squad that had all the electronic technicians and the technically trained agents. So my coworkers on my squad were the ones that were running the phone lines, running computer lines in the 26th Street Garage, which was our temporary makeshift office, because our office in Lower Manhattan, 4 blocks from the Trade Center, was shut down because it was just, it had, the air intake system just took in all that just smoke and debris, and it needed to be repaired and stuff. The office was not workable. And so we set up in our motor pool, where we had like 3 or 4 floors of a garage, maybe 2 floors of a garage, this massive industrial garage. We cleared out all the cars and we made that our office. Now that was enough to handle our administration and our basic investigative team for the Pent Bomb case, but all of the leads that were coming in, thousands of leads, if you can imagine, we needed hundreds of new investigators. So we put an investigative team on the Intrepid Air and Space Museum, which was the aircraft carrier that's now turned into a museum on the on the west side of Manhattan in the Hudson River. And so they cleared out a bunch of the old aircraft out of there, and they made the flight deck that covered the first level flight deck that's covered a huge area for all of investigators, maybe 400 or 500 investigators. And again, we had to run phone lines in there and stuff. And so I did not cover leads, and I was not part of the Pentagon team, but I was more part of the ERT operation, where I was rotating through, going out at fresh kills and sifting through a lot of things like that, being at ground zero. And then, occasionally the morgue kind of took on its own life and had specialists. And I didn't spend a whole lot of time there after the first couple of days. But yeah, that's my role, was more of a physical forensic examiner. The leads, the general leads that were coming in on the phones were being worked out of this group, out of the Intrepid. And that group consisted of not just FBI agents. I mean, everybody in the world who had a badge and a gun, who showed up wanting to work, was put to work. The assistant director of our office, Barry Maughan, said, look, any law enforcement that shows up at the Intrepid, raise their hand, you put them to work. And so this was a collaborative effort. I mean, we had people from Fish and Game, we had people from, Health and Hospitals Corporation, anybody that was a law enforcement, they had a gun and a badge, they were hooked up with an FBI team, and they would go out and help cover leads. And so that was worked out of the USS Intrepid. The Pent Bomb, and we call it Pent Bomb, PENTT, the two T's are for the Twin Towers, and bomb. And so we tried to incorporate all of the things into that. That was the case name of the case, Pent Bomb, because Pennsylvania, Pentagon, Twin Towers, and bomb is always the last. BOM is always the last three of our terrorist major cases. So that team was part of our Joint Terrorism Task Force in New York, which was the first JTTF that existed. It was formed back in 1979. Now there's one in every single field office. But that they went to work right away. And I mean, look, they were on the case already. And, now we know that, even on 9/11, we already knew who Osama bin Laden was. He was under indictment in the Southern District of New York. It was a sealed indictment, and only the FBI knew about it. But we had him indicted for his role in the East African embassy bombings. So, I mean, we knew who he was. We knew Al Qaeda very well. We had people, Ali Soufan, I don't know if you know Ali, a friend of mine who's an investigator in New York, an Arabic speaker, born in the Middle East. He was in Yemen on 9/11, and he was a very good friend of John O'Neill's, who we lost in the South Tower. John was our special agent in charge of counterterrorism. He then retired several weeks before the attacks and went to work as head of security for the World Trade Center. He perished in the South Tower, in his office in the South Tower. But Ali Soufan and a team were already in Yemen working on the USS Cole investigation. And so, overnight on September 12th, Ali is all of a sudden faced with, the Yemeni cooperation, spirit of cooperation all of a sudden overtook them. And Al Qaeda operatives that they had in custody in Yemen that heretofore we were not told about, all of a sudden they're telling Ali, hey, come in to interview this guy, come in to interview that guy. And Ali was like, well, why didn't you tell me this yesterday or last week? But all of a sudden, both Pakistan and Yemen found a new spirit of cooperation with the United States, because they were concerned that what the response of the United States was going to be to these attacks. And so we had agents. We have an office in Pakistan. We had an agent there, Jennifer Keenan, a fantastic counterterrorism agent from New York, who had then taken the legal attaché job or the assistant legal attaché job in Karachi, and she was on the ground in Pakistan. And so we had agents working this thing overseas the minute it happened. I am so honored and so thrilled that they gave me their story recently for our production, but they tell the story of the investigation, how we knew who was responsible. I mean, obviously beyond the 19 hijackers, right. They had a lot of support. They had a lot of financing,
yes,
a lot of planning to happen. And so the investigation was to track down those people who financed them, help them plan it, all of that stuff.
And speaking to your last point, why was this recent FBI report that was declassified just this Saturday? So why did it take 20 years to get this out? And it was obviously at the request of the families of the victims of 9/11. Why did it take this long?
That's a good question. That's a question for the bureaucrats in Washington to answer. I don't know why it took so long. I would have to look at the actual report, which I haven't done yet, and see the normal reason given, as you know, is to protect what we call sources and methods. That is, what method we use to gather this information that's in that report, or what source it came from, which normally means human intelligence source or human. And you want to always protect your sources and methods, because if you don't protect them, they simply dry up, and you get less people cooperating with you if they know, if they realize that they're going to be exposed to danger. And so normally there's a period of time that those sources and methods have to be protected. 20 years seems like a long time. If you remember the movie Argo, which was made about the rescuing of Iranian hostages, that didn't get declassified for 30 years. And then once it was declassified, someone read the report and said, this is a great story, let's make a movie. Now, why that wasn't done with the Osama bin Laden, why they were allowed to access those CIA files so quickly after it happened, and a doctor gets thrown in jail who helped us. And so that's where you see that. That's the reason why the doctor who helped us identify bin Laden and locate him was thrown in jail. And so those are the reasons we protect the sources and methods. And in the Iranian hostage crisis in 1980, that was done, and that movie wasn't made until 30 years later. Great movie, and that's the way it's supposed to be, because by the time 30 years passes, the sources have moved on, and the people may have been rounded up who are responsible. And so there's that time frame that you always want to keep, so your sources and methods are protected. I don't know if that's the case here. I don't really know. I will just put that out as the normal. That's the normal excuse. I will have to look. The report generally relates to. So we found out, the FBI found out the afternoon of 9/11 that the CIA knew that we had 2 Al-Qaeda operatives living in the United States, in Southern California, the San Diego area, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar. And they were associated with a number that was in Yemen, which we knew was an Al-Qaeda switchboard, basically, in Yemen, that would kind of connect people. And that number actually was given to the CIA from the FBI during the East African Embassy bombings. I
just want to stop you for 1 second, because I want everyone to come along on this journey with us, because what you're about to describe is an amazing, fascinating story. So these 2 individuals, they're 2 of the 19 suicide bombers in the 9/11 attacks. They were traced by the CIA from Saudi Arabia to Malaysia. It's a twisted plot, and they end up in Southern California, and the CIA knows about them, and then they drop the ball. Talking about bureaucracy, why wasn't this information, which you said they were actually tipped off by the FBI to initiate their investigations? CIA cannot conduct, if this is correct, correct me if I'm wrong, cannot conduct domestic investigations. Is that correct? They can't continue their investigation. So they can't continue the investigation. So then what happens?
Well, to go back, so during the East African Embassy bombings, our JTTF goes to Africa and is investigating the case. We come up with a phone number that one of the bombers who ran away from the bombing site, he was supposed to stay, he didn't. He was injured in the hospital. Our agents do an incredible job, and they get the phone number. He says, all I know is I'm supposed to call this number if anything bad happens. We go up, we find that number, we give it to NSA, and we realize that this is associated with Al-Qaeda. It's a switchboard. It's basically people coming from Afghanistan, they want to talk to the US, they call that number first and they patch them through so that nothing goes past that number. And so we give that to NSA, they share it with the CIA, and so the CIA goes up on that number, and it's a treasure trove of Al-Qaeda information. However, none of that information comes back to us, even though we gave them the number. And so
why? I mean, I think everyone's wondering why.
Here's why. Alex Station, which was at the time responsible for investigating Al-Qaeda on the CIA side, CIA is an intelligence operation. We had FBI agents assigned to Alex Station, but they were prohibited from the FBI by sharing certain information. So the JTTF in New York is a criminal investigative body. They're going to throw people in jail. They have Osama bin Laden already indicted under seal. They arrested and convicted the 1993 bombers. This is what we do. We go, we find terrorists, we investigate them, we charge them under our criminal statutes with violations of the law, we throw them in jail. That's how justice is sought in the United States. Intelligence operations have a different mindset, and they have a different goal and objective. So the worry has always been that when we go into court criminally, we have to turn everything over to defense. It's called discovery. It has to be transparent, the process and everything, to assure that rights are protected. And so the intelligence people are always worried and afraid that we're going to share some sources and methods in open court that then will be exposed and will be no longer usable to them. And so there was what we called at the time was called the wall. Sometimes called the Chinese wall, sometimes it's called the wall. And the wall separated criminal investigations from intelligence operations. And so they used the excuse of the wall why they didn't tell us. Now, our JTTF and agents like Steve Baumgart were on the tail of these guys because they knew they were associated with East Africa embassy bombings. On 5 different occasions, at least, the New York JTTF asked the CIA about Khalid al-Midhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. They asked them by name about
This
them.
is maddening. This is maddening.
And 5 times the CIA said no. Now, during the 9/11 Commission, CIA Director Tenet gets up there and he basically doesn't say the accurate things. And this blows up in the FBI and says, how could he have testified to that? The Inspector General of the CIA immediately has to start making phone calls to some people in the FBI. And 5 days later, Mr. Tenet has to reappear before the commission to amend certain of his answers. Basically, he lied the first time about whether or not the CIA ever turned that information over. To this day, they still claim they turned it over. They did not turn it over. We have proof that they didn't turn it over because every time we get something that's classified to that level, there's a log. That information has to be logged in. There are visitors logs. There's no evidence ever that they passed that information over to us. They held on to it. Now, there's a further debate about whether even if we knew, we would have been able to stop. Well, not knowing, certainly we couldn't stop it. So there's a split in the FBI about, some people think, well, we maybe have stopped that one cell, that one flight, but they didn't know that. Who knows? That's an open question. However, in my opinion, and in the opinion of certain people on the JTTF who were intimately involved in the investigation, that information should have been turned over to us. They still use it as the wall. We couldn't, in fact, on 9/11, about 2:00 in the afternoon, when the JTTF is in a phone conversation with CIA, and they tell them, these 2 guys, and they say, yeah, we knew they were living, and Steve and the people on JTF explode. And the answer was, we did it all by the book. And that was their, we did it by the book. We played this one all by the book.
Wow. Well, now there's now a lawsuit, right?
Well, there's a lawsuit because those 2 guys in Southern California, when they arrived, one or 2 of them, they have very bad English. They had a network of support. People that picked them up at LAX, Los Angeles Airport, drove them down, helped them find a place to live, helped them kind of enmesh themselves in the community, where to eat, where to go, that kind of thing. So where to pray. So they found the mosque. And so now there's even a split within the FBI about how much of that was driven by the Saudi government and how much that was just the local Saudi community. Look, I've been an expat on several occasions. After I retired, I moved to Brazil for 3 years, and I fell into a U.S. expat community who helped me out, and we would have meetings, and they would have hikes, and we would have outings and stuff. And it was just to kind of be among people who you knew or who you were more familiar with, and they would kind of slowly ingratiate you into the local community. Now, how much of that was of those 2 people, the support they got, and how much of it was, Saudi government sponsored support? That's what's open to debate. And that's what, there was one particular individual that is tied to the Saudi government, now not officially. And so different countries have different ways that they deal with, their things. And so there's a split even within the FBI about whether or not the Saudi government was actually helping support these guys, or whether it was really just the local Saudi community in Southern California who all help each other.
Right.
And I quite frankly, I don't come down on either side of that. I don't know enough about the particular case of those 2 guys. There are people that do, and even people that know very intimate details of that case. They fall on both sides of the fence. Some say, that guy was loosely associated with the Saudi government. And so, but whether or not that's the crux of the question, and that's the crux for the family, because can the family maintain a cause of action, a lawsuit against the Saudi government for supporting those 2 guys that were living in Southern California?
Right. Now, this report that we mentioned, the 16 pages, I think it does delineate some of these on-the-ground connections with the expat community that you mentioned, but does not establish an exact correlation between the Saudi government and these individuals, which obviously it's going to, I think, remain unknown. At least by the book, so we'll use the words, right? And the lawsuit that we speak of, I think a lot of these families are wondering why the CIA did not hand over this information, because I think it's a lot of only ifs, just like your flight situation, and just like, there's so many, things that led to how well orchestrated this just was, right? How many, I was reading this piece in USA Today that talked about how they had, one of those virtual mailboxes in Fort Lee, and how they, had dinner at this diner in Wayne. And I was like, my goodness, these are places that I would frequent.
Right.
I mean, did we pass by these terrorists? Were they kind of planning at the table next to us at a restaurant and not know it? I think it's that way for a lot of people.
And we shouldn't move on before we, I will also mention that, look,
Sure.
And everybody knows that there was an agent in Phoenix, and there was another agent in Minneapolis separately who said, we have guys taking flight lessons who don't have any interest in landing, and it's weird. And they both requested additional aggressive measures from FBI headquarters to follow these people. Now there was,
right.
And some people say 9/11, the failure was a failure of imagination, that we couldn't imagine that they would do something this. And so what happens is, I was a field agent my whole career. All 27 years I spent in the field. I never went to FBI headquarters, never a bureaucrat. But some of the bureaucrats that we know in all Washington institutions, as they get up the ladder in their agencies, they become more risk averse, because they don't want to jeopardize their career making a bad decision or a wrong decision or seemingly wrong decision. So when they get somebody from the field who wants to be aggressive and wants to go after somebody who's Muslim, there's a pullback, and there's a reticence, and there's a hesitation on letting the field be more aggressive about that. And so I think that was a failure also on the part of the FBI, that headquarters wasn't as aggressive in telling its field agents, go after that person, because I think there was a certain hesitancy, and they did not want to be accused of profiling or anything like that, and which is wrong.
Islamophobia.
They did not want to be accused of Islamophobia. However, and look what happens.
Yeah, I was going to say, and guess what? After 9/11, that was the backlash, is that you weren't able to target people who, in fact, may have been inside a terror cell, because. And I always give the example. It's like, if you're looking for, a culprit that has blue hair, I'm going to focus in on the culprits that have blue hair. It's not that I'm, profiling or targeting them. But, to your last point, I always refer to 9/11 as a loss of innocence for this country, because there's so many, these attackers took advantage of our innocence, of our naivete in certain ways. And now you can't get a one-way ticket, on an airline without there being, questions asked at the gate, or, going on without luggage, or the way that we have, 25 different body scans at the airport, and all those different things. Obviously, we learned from those mistakes. But I think for years we've tried to kind of wrap our heads around this war on terror, right? So we went into Afghanistan, we went into Iraq. We were actually then continually reminded this funding is actually coming from Tehran, from Qatar, from other places. And basically it's been like playing whack-a-mole, right? It's very difficult to fight an ideology that spreads as fast as a YouTube video or a post on Facebook or a WhatsApp chat. How would you characterize this evolution of the war on terror here in the U.S. Over the last 20 years? And what's your assessment? Are we safer today from an attack of that scale than we were on that day?
To answer your last question first, yes, I think we are safer. I don't think we're as safe as we could be, but I approach it from a criminal investigator's mindset, right? And so, but I always have to remember that that's not the only mindset that comes into play, particularly when the decisions are made at a higher level. Policymakers and government officials don't always have my 100% mindset of a criminal investigator. And so civil liberties come into play, and there are different impacting points of view other than just me if it was me as a criminal investigator, I can tell you a whole slew of things that should be put into effect. But I also know that there's a constitution and we need to protect people's rights. So there's always a balance. And that's what people don't understand. Like when 9/11 happens, some of these things in retrospect, you don't see the benefit of the balance, because you realize what bad thing happened. So you're like, oh my God, we should have totally done all this other stuff. But before the bad thing really happens, we always have to play that balancing game, right? So we're balanced by civil libertarians and by policymakers and also diplomacy. So you talked about Qatar, and you talked about Tehran and the financing, and there are. And I'm not a diplomat, and I've never worked for the State Department, but I know they have to navigate that arena of diplomacy and relationships and things like that. And so it's not always clear cut. Everybody looks at it through my lens because we're all, amateur detectives, we're all investigators, we're all, we have it. But the diplomatic side and the civil libertarian side also kind of comes into play. Now, should they? To what extent? What gets weighted? How much weight is given to those factors? That's the ongoing debate all the time. Should we give more weight to civil liberties? Should we give more weight to the criminal law enforcement? Should we give more weight to the diplomacy aspects? And so those are things that are always going to be debated, and we have to strike some balance. Couldn't we be 100% safe? Sure. We could be 100%. We strip search everybody that ever goes near anything, right? On a train, on a plane, on a bus, so there are ways to be 100% safe, and there are ways to be not safe at all. And so where on that spectrum we fall is really up to the American people. It's who we elect as our elected representatives, what kind of path the Patriot Act or what kind of acts are passed. And so as a society, I don't get to decide that. And I fully understand that. And when I was a criminal investigator, I would abide by whatever laws were in place at the time. And I would respect people's constitutional rights, of course. And that's paramount. And that's the oath I took.
Right.
But where we end up on that spectrum, and that's kind of always a moving thing.
Exactly.
Society, that's what we have to. I mean, people should be engaged in that. They should be talking to their local elected officials and their federal elected officials, and they should be engaged in that conversation.
Yeah, it's similar to what we're having with the debate around the vaccine, for example. I think, like you said, it's a moving piece, and I think people have different opinions depending on their personal view on that item, on that subject. So it's difficult to kind of have a hard and fast rule about our freedoms versus the government's control and their mandates. We have to take a look at Afghanistan for a moment. In the scheme of the 20-year war on terror, in the scheme of, like you said, trying to be 100% on U.S. soil, while respecting civil liberties and our Constitution and all of that. Now we have added another factor here. We've given a terror organization a complete sovereign state to rule and to now. I guess that's why I asked the question, are we any better off when it seems like the fight that we got into ended in a way that's much worse than some do-it-yourself jihadis planning and plotting in a cave in the corner of Afghanistan?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, if we just a brief history of it, so we know that Al-Qaeda is the organization that carried out the 9/11 attack, the most brutal attacks in the history of our country, domestic terrorist attacks domestically. And it was planned out by Al-Qaeda, who had been given safe haven by the Taliban, who was basically the controlling, if you will, government of Afghanistan from 95 or 96. And so they gave them not only safe haven, but they gave them places to train and have these massive training camps and move around. And so avoid detection, avoid surveillance and things like that. So our war of going into Afghanistan to weed out Al-Qaeda, really, we did give the Taliban a very brief period of time to provide us with the Al-Qaeda, and when they refused, we went in. Very briefly, they were given the opportunity, and they chose not to take it. So the Taliban was not the enemy per se. The Taliban was the people who gave safe haven to Al-Qaeda, who was the real enemy who attacked us. The Taliban, to this day, I don't believe, has the desire to mount international jihad and to attack the United States. They may, but in my opinion, the bigger danger is they will, of course, give safe haven to Islamic fundamentalists and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and groups like that to re-flourish, right? And like you said before, it's a whack-a-mole thing, and you have to kind of always be vigilant in striking them where they pop their heads up. Well, now we have this entire country where we can't get to. We can't reach with our little mallets and knock them down. And so I think that the reason why we haven't been attacked for the last 20 years is we've taken the fight to them overseas. We've kept them on the run. We've been here, we've been there, we've been whacking those moles wherever now we have this huge area of land we can't reach. Our mallets won't reach. And so how quickly they flourish, how quickly they now kind of come into being again, and how quickly they start using that area to train and to plan attacks and then export those attacks is anybody's guess. I hope that our intelligence services are on it. I hope our military stays somehow engaged in that fight so that we can monitor them. But that's the clear danger is now that they have the Taliban, a willing, I hate to even call them a government, but they have a willing government now there, a state that's going to allow them to have training camps and to train and
Exactly.
carry out that. They claim not to, but we know
Right.
we can't trust their word, obviously.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I agree exactly with what you said, that they will be in cahoots with one another. What was your reaction with that opinion? What was your reaction to the U.S. saying that we're sharing intel with the Taliban in order to go after ISIS-K for the attack at that Kabul airport?
Yeah, it's so concerning, because by all accounts, some of the same actors from 20 years ago and intervening people that were in Guantanamo Bay and people that we know to be, major sponsors of terrorism have now come back into major positions within the Taliban government, if you will, of Afghanistan. So we're dealing with some of the same people that we hunted down and know are sympathetic to terrorism, if they're not terrorists themselves. So it's really concerning that we put ourselves in this position where now we don't control that landmass, or we don't have a friendly government that helps us to have access to that landmass. And now we've ceded to a group of people that clearly is more sympathetic to the terrorists than to us. And now to be having to be beholden to that group of people to say, we'll share this with you, but you have to help us get these people. They've clearly established that they're more sympathetic to those people. They're more aligned with those people, those terrorists. And so it really creates a really unfortunate situation, I think, that we have to at all ever rely on anything to do with the Taliban.
Right, right. I heard you say a few times throughout the course of our conversation that the FBI is split on this, the FBI is split on that. How has the FBI changed over the last few decades in terms of, inserting themselves as an agency in the political play that takes place in Washington, the president that's in office? It's unusual to hear that an agency like the CIA or the FBI or law enforcement by any standard, it would be split on anything when their job, to me, seems so clear cut.
Well, I mean, again, it all depends on, FBI agents are people just like everybody else, and we actually do in certain states serve on juries and things like that. So it's a matter of, how much evidence you as a person need to presented with to believe something. So when I say, like, for example, there's a split within the FBI, some FBI agents believe that the Saudi government did support, some people don't. The people that don't say that the Saudi government didn't support them, those two terrorists that were living in Southern California. They simply say, we don't see enough evidence to be comfortable with making that statement definitively. So where you're comfortable, like where a juror is comfortable with saying beyond a reasonable doubt or not beyond, so it's that kind of analysis. So you have some agents that say, when I look at the totality of this information, in my mind, the Saudi government was providing support to these people. Well, you have other agents who are, so we're as diverse as the population at large, not really, but we should be, who look at that same body of information and say, well, it looks like it's possible, but it's not enough evidence for me to feel comfortable making that declaration.
Do you think that FBI agents particularly over the last 5-6 years, have allowed their politics to sway and influence their work increasingly?
Well, some have clearly. I mean, yes, there's no denying that. We've seen the text, we've seen the things. So there's no denying that there was what I call a cabal that had kind of ascended to power in the FBI. Hopefully, now I know that the people of that cabal are gone, because I knew some of them, and they're gone. Now, whether or not that spouts up again, hopefully the director and some people have put safeguards into place so that never happens again. We had a group of people who ascended to power in the FBI who allowed their political leanings to come into play. You had a deputy director of the FBI whose wife was running as a political party. That would have never happened years ago. And so taking money from a political organization, and so it was always the appearance of impropriety is enough, right? And certainly there was a lot of appearances of a lot of impropriety going on, and the protestations to I never did anything political, it doesn't matter. The appearance of impropriety is enough to call your credibility into question, and the FBI has always relied on its credibility. Now the thing that I always kind of keep my is that most of that happened at FBI headquarters. And even when it happens in the field, like we're seeing in Indianapolis with the Larry Nassar investigation, I mean, we see it happen with the head of the office who's politically motivated because he's looking for a job in the private sector and things like that. So the field agent, the working field agent, which I was for 27 years, is out there. Those FBI agents are out there doing the job every day, and they're doing it without regard to political affiliation. They're doing it without regard to religious or any other type of affiliation. They're doing it very objectively. They're doing it by the law. They're protecting the Constitution. There are some bureaucrats within any government agency that rise up to a level where they start allowing their political leanings or their career ambitions to influence their decision making. That's unfortunate. That always has to be weeded out. That's why inspector generals exist, to keep an eye on that kind of stuff and that, and other things. But that kind of stuff is important to watch and to make sure that those bureaucrats are not allowing themselves to be swayed. And unfortunately, it happens. The only thing you can hope for was when it does happen, it gets caught and those people are weeded out and new people take their place. And if those people start doing it, then there's the safeguards that are in place to stop them before they can do some damage. Unfortunately, in the situations like we've seen in the last few years, damage has been done. And now we have to work to restore the confidence of the American people.
Sure, absolutely. What's interesting is when you were telling the story about your flight on 9/11, I thought to myself, no wonder this guy spends his time writing for shows like Criminal Mind and others, because it seems like your real life stories are actually more Hollywood than the Hollywood stories you write. I'm sure you have a ton of great stories, and you're a masterful storyteller, which is why, it's such a pleasure to have you on this show. But now as you move forward, where do you find the inspiration for your on-air stories?
It's easy for me. I find inspiration in the working FBI agents that are out there in the field every day doing the job, and those are my colleagues, and so I'm not unique. I have a very interesting career, but so does every other FBI agent out there that's worked 25 years in the field, in the street. And so when I started the After the Fall project, I went and I found 30, 35 people that were working in New York or Shanksville or the Pentagon on the ground. And we interviewed them at length, and then we built a story and we tied the stories together. It's not I abhor to call it a podcast because it's really a verbal telling of a historical document record. And so you'll hear from Ali Soufan directly. You'll hear from Steve Baumgart directly, Kenny Maxwell, Mary Galligan, who is the overall leader of the Pent Bomb investigation, talks at length in the project. And so you'll hear the people that were on the ground at the Pentagon minutes after the attack. You'll hear from the people that were in Shanksville, recovering the black boxes and the human remains from that crash site. You'll hear from the people at the morgue, Jerry Cucuzzo, who ran the morgue operation in New York City. You'll hear directly from them. You'll hear from the people that were running the investigation. What was happening in Yemen? What was happening in Pakistan? Steve Baumgart went from the JTTF. He was at Ground Zero by December of 2001. He's in Afghanistan. He's interviewing people taken off the field of battle by the military, a first of its kind thing for the FBI. So you'll hear how he set up a little interview room in a bombed out airport in Afghanistan, and he's dealing with these military guys who are taking these guys off the field of battle. So you will hear the entire story of the 9/11 investigation, how we got to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, who is now on trial down in Gitmo, how we got to people like Abu Zubaydah, how we captured him, and the shootout during which he was wounded, and how we, FBI agents are basically plugging his wounds to keep him alive because we know the value of this guy and all the information he has about 9/11. And so, and that happened in Pakistan. And so, you'll hear these incredible stories. And After the Fall is available on audible.com. And it's, I think 16 or 17 episodes, about 8 hours in total that you listen, and you'll hear directly from these people telling you the story. There's a narrator who carries you along on the story and takes you along. But to me, it's a riveting telling of how we, it basically starts with East Africa embassy bombings. We have 1 or 2 episodes called Before the Fall, but After the Fall is really about what happened, how the FBI sprung into action the afternoon of 9/11, and then from there on, and how we tracked down all the way to Osama bin Laden getting killed by the Navy SEALs and things. And so I think it's a great historical record for all Americans to listen to. It's 6 hours that you'll find, I think, very beneficial and very educational about what happened after the fall. And for me, I'm writing other projects now, and it's just I rely on the incredible work done by my colleagues currently and people that are retired. I want to be in a position to tell. I'm a storyteller. I want to tell their stories. If they're not storytellers, they have the experience. I can draw the stories out of them, and I can tell it in the proper way. And so that's what I see as my calling now in my second career, is to keep telling the stories of the incredible work done by the hardworking men and women of the FBI.
Yeah, indeed. And thank you so much, because you do tell a very good story. And the way that you really paint out the story, the experience that you had. And I thank you for your expertise. I thank you for your service to this country, your continued service in telling these stories. It's absolutely amazing. And I highly, highly recommend that you watch After the Fall. I will link it under the podcast on YouTube. And I thank you, Bobby, for coming back on. I hope that you'll join us once again very soon. And for those of you who would like to subscribe to our weekly podcast, go to youtube.com/Lisa Daftari. And to sign up for our daily top 10 email Lisa's list, go to foreigndesknews.com. And we'll see you all next week.